Hey, how goes it, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Royalties of Recovery with your host, Gemini Guy. So today, I kind of just want to touch on, a big part of the epidemic that's going on in America right now, and that's opioids, fentanyl, and the overdoses that are associated with it. So it's pretty common that the East Coast is seeing a lot more overdoses and deaths, ultimately, than you are on the West Coast or the Midwest, with the exception of Ohio, obviously. But they're like mid-east, kind of. So anyways, I have a theory behind that, and to me it makes a lot of sense, and today I'm going to share it with you. So, on the West Coast, primarily what you see is like black tar heroin. That's what's out here. That's what you get for the most part. Now, don't get me wrong. There's definitely, fentanyl and other more potent forms of heroin that you would see on the East Coast. But, so, in the last 10 years, getting drugs from Afghanistan has changed dramatically. So, Afghanistan is one of the world's top producers of opium and heroin. But it's not as easy for them to get it over anymore. So, a lot of what they're doing is sending it to Mexico, and then Mexico will distribute it, accordingly. Mexico is a big part of the drug trade in the U.S. and how things are going down, which isn't news to anybody. I'm sure all of you are very, very well aware of that. But so in the East Coast, you see a lot more overdose deaths. So in New York, this is from 2017, there was 3,224 deaths related to overdoses of opioids. That is 16.1 people per 100,000 people that died in a year from opioid-related deaths. And then in Connecticut, 955 people died of overdose deaths. That's 27.7 people per 100,000 people in Connecticut dying from overdoses. Now, when you venture to the West Coast, those numbers go down dramatically. And I'm going to share with you why I think that. So, in California, there was 2,199 deaths. That's 5.3 deaths per 100,000 people. In Washington, you had 742 total overdose deaths. That's a rate of 9.6 people per 100,000. Now, these numbers are dramatically lower than what's going on the East Coast. Now, in New York, the number's high as far as a total, but the total per 100,000 people goes down a little bit. But there's a lot more people in New York than most places. Like per square mile, they have a lot more people. So, and then you get to Ohio. In Ohio, it is 4,293 deaths for the year 2017. That's 39.2 per 100,000 people. That is astronomical. That's a lot of people in 1 year. So, I'm going to get into it a little bit more about why I think that and how this is happening. So, when drugs come over from Mexico, okay, the West Coast in general is a lot closer a lot of the smuggling comes from Southern California for multiple reasons, but a big thing right now is those tunnels. Now, there's areas of California and Mexico where the ground is like a sandstone, so it's easy to dig, but yet it's still, the tunnels can still be sturdy. So there's these tunnels everywhere, and they're smuggling it through the tunnels. Well, the risk factor goes down. So when they smuggle something over the border from Mexico and they need to ship it to Washington State, okay, so yeah, they get it over the border, but you still have a good chance of getting caught from Southern California to Washington. Now, you smuggle it from Southern California, Arizona, Texas, wherever, those odds increase dramatically. So it makes more sense for them, once it gets from, Mexico into Southern California, they're going to take their product, opium or heroin that was produced in Mexico, and they're going to supply it to people that are closer. There's less risk involved, and they don't have to travel as far. So they distribute the stuff they grow in the West Coast because there's a little bit more guarantee on their product. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be stuff that gets caught at the border or wherever it goes, but it lessens the odds the farther they have to travel with it. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a whole East Coast over there where there is money to be made. There's a lot of money on the East Coast. But traditionally, the East Coast is used to heroin in a powder form. Generally, it's white, because for a long time it all came from Afghanistan. Well, since the war in Afghanistan and just customs and border patrol getting tougher on stuff, it's harder for Afghanis to get it into the States. So now they too depend on Mexico more than they used to. So they'll ship their drugs to Mexico or get them to Mexico however they may, and then proceed to get them to the East Coast. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of shady stuff going on with shipments being lost and things like that, when really the cartels are just keeping it for themselves. But at the same time, you don't want to kill your gift horse. You don't want to ruin a good thing, if you will. So they're still distributing some of it, but then you throw in China. Now this is something that, has just happened fairly recently within the last, 5 to 10 years, is fentanyl is coming onto the market 20-fold. So, but you still only see a majority of those deaths on the East Coast. Now, most of the stuff, not all of it, but most of the stuff that comes from out of the country, and I'm talking, clothes, toys, TVs, whatever it may be, is going to come in through JFK Airport, which is in the East Coast, or on the East Coast. So it has to do with the farther you have to send it, the better your odds are of getting busted. So they have all this fentanyl come in, mostly from JFK Airport, and then they just ultimately distribute it on the East Coast. Because, once again, the farther it has to go, the more your odds increase that you're going to get busted. So a majority of it stays on the East Coast. And now Ohio specifically, I have a feeling that Canada is definitely playing into this too. If there's a dollar to be made, or in this case hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars, people are going to get it across the border. But so fentanyl comes in from JFK, and then it's distributed all around. And then you get street level dealers who will use it to stretch out product they already have. Because another thing with fentanyl is, it's 80 to 100 times more potent than heroin, but the lifespan of it, the lasting effect is way shorter. A heroin user can last anywhere from 8 to 12 hours without doing another dose. Whereas if you're just doing fentanyl, you're looking at like a 2 to maybe at the very most 6 hour lifespan. So that's why you see these dealers cutting it, because they get the lasting effect of the heroin, but yet they get that initial high of the fentanyl. And then another thing is China, at one point in time it was legal for them to ship fentanyl to America. And then America made it illegal. Well, fentanyl is a man-made drug. Somebody in a lab somewhere is making this. So they changed one molecule slightly, and then it would become legal again. So this isn't the case anymore, but 2-3 years ago it was. They could still send it legally. And then, so America gets kind of hip to drugs coming in from China. Well, then they do what's called like a transshipment. They'll send all their fentanyl to, wherever, Norway or Istanbul or, wherever, and then repackage it and send it over to America, so it's not flagged initially as possibly being drugs. And then another thing that like Customs and Border Protection are faced with is we as Americans, we buy millions and millions of items from China because China makes a lot of stuff that we use. That's just the way it is. It's a fact of life. So you already have millions of shipments coming from China, and then to try and intercept those packages that are faulty, that are drugs, it's nearly impossible. There's obviously not a 100% statistic as far as what's intercepted and what's not, because nobody knows what's getting by. Nobody can give you a cement answer on that, but I think they estimated that it's around 4%. So they're catching 4% of the illegal narcotics coming in. That leaves 96% that are making it to the streets. And, of that 96%, there's going to be X amount that get caught by other law enforcement agencies, and then stuff that gets lost or ruined. It happens, but it's still an astronomical amount of drugs that are ultimately making it to the streets. And then another thing with, fentanyl versus like heroin or prescription painkillers is 1 ounce of fentanyl can turn into, 10 times the amount of doses 1 ounce of heroin was. So a statistic that I seen was 200 grams of, pure or high purity fentanyl can turn into roughly 2.5 million doses from its pure form to being cut. Because, the average normal Joe, even if you are a heroin addict, cannot do pure fentanyl because it is so potent. So you can take 1 ounce of heroin, and this is for my area, and maybe even a big estimate for, you can take 1 ounce for roughly $1,000 and make it, very most $5,000. Whereas you can take 1 ounce of fentanyl and turn it into almost $300,000. So they have to move less of it around, and they ultimately make more profit. So, any businessman can see what makes more sense there. But as far as Mexico's concerned, you know, there's still people in Mexico growing poppies, and it's not necessarily cartel members. It's the people of Mexico who want to make a buck too. So the cartels aren't going to turn that down. And don't, you know, cartel members are not stupid. They understand how it works. If they end up killing off majority of their customers, don't get me wrong, more will always come. But if you kill off your clientele, then that's ultimately less money in your pocket. So I know at least in Ohio, for example, the overdose rates are starting to drop. And I equate that to the same thing, is that initially when it got big and fentanyl was coming in, nobody knew how much to cut it or how to associate it. And now they're figuring it out, you know, making it safer so they're not killing as many people. But there's always human error involved, whether that's the person that's cutting it or the user. Oh, I can do a little bit more, or, you know, oh, this is the same stuff, and it ends up not being. It's extremely dangerous. I mean, extremely dangerous. To, you know, a person with no opioid dependence, it's literally like the tip of a pencil lead, or, you know, 2-3 grains of salt, boom, will kill you. So, I mean, it's very dangerous. And with the danger, it directly correlates with law enforcement. They raid a house that, you know, they think maybe is a heroin house, and ultimately there's fentanyl, and they're rifling through it and find the bag, it rips open, goes into the air, then they're susceptible to overdoses. It's killing millions of people all over, you know, and I can't imagine what the, you know, there's got to be people in China dying that are preparing it and getting it over, and all the innocent people handling a package that wasn't packaged properly, and then not to mention, you know, the addicts over here. The number's crazy. Law enforcement alone has had overdoses that were, you know, luckily a lot of them were saved, but there's been instances where they've died. And parents who end up finding this in their child's bedroom, you know. It's just a substance. It doesn't care. You know, it's going to do what it does regardless. And as far as the addiction aspect is concerned, you know, it doesn't care if you're white or black, rich, poor, male, female, you know, religion. None of that matters. It will take everything you have, whether you want it to or not. And, you know, I wasn't trying to necessarily make this like a negative video, but just to shed some light on it. It's something that's going on. You know, it's something that's close to a lot of us. There's a lot of people out here who have lost loved ones. You know, I've lost a lot of friends, people I grew up with, you know, people I know, good people, not, you know, not people who deserved it. Nobody deserves it. There's worse people than others, but nobody deserves it. Because that person has a mom and a dad, and nobody should have to go through that. But, you know, with that being said, I hope I shed some light on it. You know, a lot of it is just economics and, you know, geographic location. And, you know, that makes some of us on the West Coast a little more fortunate. But with the way the internet is now, anybody who's semi-savvy can get on there and order it. And just because you're in the drug world doesn't mean that you're not smart or an entrepreneur. It just takes that one guy who decides he wants to do that, and then more people start dying. So, yeah, I just wanted to shed some light. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if in fact you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and comment if there's something you want to see or get my take on, or you want me to talk about. Please leave a comment. I'm very, very open to that. And with that being said, just remember, if you're out there struggling, if I can get clean and sober, I promise you can too. That doesn't mean that it won't be hard, but you can definitely do it. You just got to put the effort forth, and things will get better, I promise. If you get sobriety handled, good things will come. It'll take time, but things fall into place. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go. Until we meet again next time, I hope you all have an awesome day. Later.